This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. My guest today is an artist whose work you have surely seen before, probably many times, but you likely don't know his name, though you should. I am beyond honored to be joined by Frank Verlizzo, one of the most prominent, prolific, and influential theatrical poster designers in Broadway history. Frank is better known by the single name Fraver. For 5 decades, his work has been burned into the memories of every serious theater lover on planet Earth. Frank's posters have helped to sell and represent such shows as The Lion King, Ragtime, Once, 1776, Deathtrap, Buried Child, Carrie, Baby, and a whole host of shows written by Stephen Sondheim, including Follies, Into the Woods, Sunday in the Park with George, and perhaps my favorite poster from my favorite musical, Sweeney Todd. But most near and dear to my own heart, Frank designed the memorable first ever poster for a little show I had something to do with, Jekyll Hyde the musical. In 1987, Fraver's designs garnered him a special Drama Desk Award for consistently inspired artwork for theatrical productions, an honor that was never before bestowed in the area of theatrical advertising. In 2011, the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center presented a retrospective exhibit of his posters in celebration of his illustrious career. In 2017, Fraver was a recipient of Pratt Institute's Alumni Achievement Award, which recognizes outstanding graduates who have distinguished themselves in their fields. And Frank has recently published Fraver by Design, one of the most beautiful, eye-popping art books I've ever read. If you love the art of illustration, I highly urge you to check it out. You can find it on Amazon.com, on Fraver.com, and at fine booksellers everywhere. This is a true pleasure for me to have the one and only Frank Verlizzo on StoryBeat. Frank, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Steve. What a great introduction.
Well,
so humbled.
well earned and well deserved. So let's get the most obvious question out of the way, and that is, how did Frank Verlizzo get to the name Fraver? It seems fairly obvious, but tell us how.
Yeah, well, when I realized when I was in high school, I went to the High School of Art and Design on 57th Street in Manhattan, that many people, mostly my teachers, could not pronounce my last name, which is Verlizzo. I think they would see it in print and get a little taken aback by the V and the double Z's and just would have trouble with it, fumbling with it. So I decided to try to shorten it and give myself an artist name. So I took the FRA from Frank and the VER from Verlizzo and started using it on my work for school, and seemed to have gotten a good reception from everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided to let it stick. So by the time I went to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, I really very much always signed my work Fraver, and that continued on.
And there, I assume there are many people that do not know. They see Fraver, but they have no idea what your full name is, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Some people think it is my only name, like Cher. Some people think it's my last name. Some people think it's my first. Yeah, over the years I've gotten many combinations. Some of my actually longtime clients never connected the Fraver to the Frank Verlizzo.
Oh, that's funny.
As an advertising creative director, they never made the connection that I was also designing.
Oh,
so it was funny.
That's amazing when people don't make that hookup. But so tell us a bit about how you got started. What inspired you way back when to be an artist in the first place, and then how did you become a someone who specializes in theatrical posters?
Well, I always loved drawing, and portraiture was always my major interest. And having gone to High School of Art and Design, which sort of nurtured that, at Pratt Institute, definitely I knew that's what I wanted to do, something to do with illustration, portraiture, faces. I was big on Hollywood movies, so I did a lot of movie star portraits. And I was very fortunate that one of my teachers in my senior year at Pratt was David Edward Byrd, who was a very, very famous poster design artist who had done the original Godspell poster.
Right.
And at the point that I was taking classes with him, he was doing the art for the Follies poster, Stephen Sondheim's original production. So I actually got to watch that piece of art be created, which was pretty fantastic. And I think that alone left a huge impression on me.
Sure.
And when I was getting ready to graduate, David, who pretty much knew that I had the entertainment industry in my blood, suggested I show my work at a theatrical ad agency that he worked with quite often. And I did, and after a couple of months of doing freelance assignments for them, they offered me a job in the production department, which I snapped immediately because that was like heaven to me.
Were you ever involved in the theater as a performer or an artist in it somehow?
No, never connected to it at all, except as a theater goer. I mean, as a kid living in New York, certainly my mom took me to many shows.
Sure.
So I did have exposure to Broadway, but not in a sense where I was connecting what I was doing to that. I always connected my work to movies up until Pratt. Then I started to think a little differently.
Did you study the great movie poster designers?
Oh, absolutely. And I also collected, and well, very rarely now because space is an issue, but I've collected movie posters since I was a kid, so I have quite a collection.
Do you know who Drew Struzan is?
Of course. How could I not know who Drew Struzan is?
Well, just
He's fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic.
But my all-time favorite is Richard Amsel.
Oh, right, sure.
Who really, unfortunately, left us way too soon, but did some of the most glorious and beautiful movie posters ever, I think.
So at what point in your life did you know, was it at Pratt or before, that you really had talent for this?
Well, it's like I went to school with so many talented people, and I have to say what we all had in common was that none of us felt all that talented when you looked around and saw what else was out there.
Of course, everybody thinks that way.
Yeah, I do think so, and that's what keeps you going. You just strive to get better at what you're doing, and I think that was my driving force, was just to learn as much about it as I could and to get to be as good at it.
Sure. Do you feel that way still, that you're still striving? less so.
Not as much, but yeah, there's always that feeling when I'm working on any new show is am I coming up with the best idea for this? I'm really prolific in terms of coming up with concepts, and which is wonderful, and that's always been I feel like a gift that I have. But is it the best one? So as a result, I tend to, especially now with the technology. Years ago, before we had computers, it took an awfully long time to do a poster.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Now I could come up with a concept and do it fairly quickly because I don't have to wait for like an outside vendor to set the type, or to, just things like that were time consuming.
Sure.
So I can actually produce more of my concepts for a client than I used to be able to. So that allows me the freedom to come up with ideas that I might think exemplify the show or show the show in a light that I think would sell, as opposed to what my previous conversation with the producers lead me to believe the show is actually about. So I do a mixture. I do my ideal and segue into their ideal and do some in between. So I sometimes, depending on the show, can come up with at least seven or eight totally different concepts to present to a client, so that there's a range of ideas to talk about and looks to talk about.
Do you try and make them very different,
what
or
works for them?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Depending on the show, yes. Sometimes I experiment. That's the also wonderful thing about what I do, is that there's no rule in terms of how you have to present this piece of art. I can really do an illustration. I could do a graphic. I could do a photo montage. I could just do a type logo. It just really depends on what I think the show would best be represented by.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, the client does make that decision. I just present the options.
Well, sure. Ultimately, somebody's paying you to do something for them.
Exactly.
Do you do, which makes me wonder, do you do art for yourself? Do you just do other kinds of art?
I do. Well, I still like to do portraits. That's still my favorite, although over the years I've gotten away from doing it as much as I used to. But that's something that I certainly am trying to ease myself back into doing for pleasure, because that is my favorite thing.
And does doing one influence or inspire the other?
Well, I actually feel like they're totally different, because in terms of a portrait, although certainly there's an underlying concept behind what you want the portrait to say, it doesn't have to send a message. It's not an advertising tool, whereas the other thing I do for a living is an advertising tool, and it is meant to activate someone to buy a ticket, or at least become interested enough to buy a ticket.
Well, I think that's one of the most astonishing things about, certainly when you see all of your work laid out in a book like Fraver by Design, the thing that just jumps out at me anyway is how virtually everything has a message to it. Everything is saying something, and it's not just a pure piece of abstraction or something to just enjoy. It has something deeper going on. So you must think about these things long and hard.
Oh, yes, very much so.
And, okay, so...
And, read the script many times, and once again, try to certainly talk to the producers, but also if it's possible, to talk to the creatives, to talk to the playwright or the book writer or the lyricist, just to get information about their perception of the show and what they think is the most important aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important for me to know. Sometimes, I use it all as a bank. I'm banking it in the back of my mind. When I'm designing, sometimes I don't feel that most of it applies, but like I sort of referred to before, if I feel the idea is strong enough and really exemplifies the show in a different way, I do actually design it, because they may not have thought of it that way, but it may be the way to think about it in terms of selling a ticket.
How frequently does a producer or company present you with a script or just a basic idea and then let you run free? Does that happen all the time?
Yeah, pretty much that's the way it works. I have to say that over the years, I know just personally that if a producer asks or tells me, this is what I want the artwork to be. I want an illustration of a person doing this, and that's giving me way too much information.
I see.
And I very often suggest that they talk to another artist who can probably translate that for them. But that isn't the way I work. I tend to cull all the information I can from them and then go off and do my thing.
So when you say cull the information, let's tell the audience what that means. First of all, you have a script of some kind.
Yes, absolutely. The script is always the first thing, my first exposure to the show. Sometimes it's clear the intention of the script. I mean, I've read scripts that didn't have cover pages, and honestly didn't know if they were supposed to be comedies or dramas. Or I mean, I just even after reading it, I wasn't sure. So, you know, it's the kind of thing where then speaking to everyone involved, the creatives involved, certainly is very important to me, because I need to have a little more of a sense of what their intention is.
I'm not so sure it's a good thing that a script comes to you that it's supposed to be a comedy, but you can't tell.
Well, you know, it's amazing to me, and this is why you know, as much as I love reading scripts, and certainly they really, really are my cornerstone in terms of starting designing, I am a terrible critique of script writing, because I couldn't tell you if the show was going to be a huge hit or if it was going to be a disaster, or, you know, why would anybody want to see this? Or I have there's nothing happening in my mind that sort of processes that way. So to me, every script is going to be the next Chorus Line or Sweeney Todd, and that's the way I treat them, which is probably good.
You're in other words, you're not a good prognosticator for the hit or miss of a show.
No, not at all. And over the years, I've been proven wrong time and time again. So I've learned to keep my opinions about it to myself, and it works out very well that way.
That may be an astoundingly good piece of advice for all sorts of things in life. Is sometimes just keeping it to yourself may be the way to go in so many different ways. When you okay, so you've got the script and you've read it and you start to conceptualize. You begin to get ideas about what to do. What is your next step? Do you just start to draw, or how do you do it?
Well, once again, it depends, and you know, certainly with technology, like I said, I could work on a variety of pieces at the same time. So when I may have a type design in mind that I know goes with idea number 3, so I'll start on that while I'm trying to formulate idea number 1. Or I jump around, which is something I couldn't really do before when I first started. You pretty much had to focus on one thing at a time. So the nice thing about this is that because I have so many ideas generally, I'm able to work on them all at the same time. And while I'm working on them, formulate other concepts that, you know, weren't even in my head when I started. But one thing, as usual, one thing always leads to another. And I find that quite often either the first idea I've come up with or the last idea I've come up with, generally the ones that get chosen the most. That's
interesting. So it's the initial burst of inspiration, and sometimes you have to develop it.
Yeah. And sometimes the last one I do only because I like the idea, but I never really remotely think they're going to react to it at all.
That's interesting.
Sometimes it's, you know, it's the one everybody gravitates toward, and that's, you know, it's wonderful. It's like, wow, okay.
So sometimes
that's where my instinct comes in, I guess.
You're going out on a limb, you think, but in fact it's the one.
Well, you know, going out on a limb is good when you have 10 other things to back it up.
Sure. Oh, yeah, I guess that's right.
If I were just going out on the limb with one piece, I don't think I'm brave enough to do that.
Yeah, I think that sounds exactly right, because that one piece then isn't compared to anything else, and the comparison sometimes takes it to a different level. You see, I see how this works.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Are you working mostly in Photoshop?
Yes, Photoshop and Illustrator
are
Illustrator. My 2 programs.
And I assume you've become pretty proficient at those these days.
Yes, I very much am very proficient at them, and which is delightful. I think they're amazing.
And your ability to control, like you say, typeface and size and shape and so on is much greater than it was in the past.
Oh, absolutely. You know, in the past, when I first started, when I had a type design in mind, I would have to draw it out and send it to a type house for them to follow, but they're the ones that had to set and manipulate the actual font. I didn't have the capabilities to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly at Pratt, I took 2 years of hand lettering, so I certainly could do it. I was capable of doing it. But when you're working at an ad agency, they don't want you sitting there for 8 hours, doing a type design.
Right.
You need to work a little faster than that.
But you have the ability to design fonts yourself then, yes?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I love type. I love playing with type and just sort of manipulating type. That's a pleasure for me to do.
Well, and I think that is completely evident in your work. I mean, it's obvious that you love to manipulate type. It just shows. You can see it.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, you're more than welcome. So once you have the concepts, you then present them to the buyers. How frequently have you done all this work and everything was rejected? Does that ever happen?
I have to say, very slim that everything was rejected, and the meeting ended with no direction.
Right.
The worst case scenario would be that, and let me temper this also by telling you that we're talking about trying to get 5 or 10 people to agree on something.
And 5 or 10 creative people.
Yes. So right there, you have a huge hurdle. My part of my job is, aside from being the designer, being the creative director, is trying to wrangle everybody, get their opinions, and then try to get people to focus so that we can narrow down, say, 10 ideas to at least 3, so we have a starting point. I have to say, I can't even really think of an instance where I had a presentation and it was just a big bust. Like, it was like, oh, we hate everything. I don't think that ever happened. There was always a glimmer of something or a starting point, so that even if I had to have another presentation, 2 weeks later, there was definitely a very strong direction to follow to going into it.
So in other words, your instincts have proven to be awfully good for a very long time.
Well, I like to think so.
Yeah, I would say the proof of the pudding's in the eating.
We'll say yes to that one.
When you're designing or where you're coming up with concepts, do you let me see how I can ask this. Do you have a certain audience in your head? Are you preparing it for you? Are you preparing it because you know the particular person you're presenting it to and what their tastes are? Or are you preparing it for the man in the street? Or are you not thinking about any of that?
Well, no, I think of all of that, and part of our initial discussions definitely include who's our initial audience.
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to be the first person, who's going to be the easiest audience member to capture to see this show.
Right.
That's generally the first discussion of what that group of people entails. And although I use my marketing knowledge from having worked in all these ad agencies, you sort of learn it by osmosis, and from going to meetings where you hear where you hear the account executives' take on what's going on and the writer's take on what's going on. You just learn what's important and what isn't, and what sells and what doesn't. And I think the best kind of client is the one who's willing to not fully take your word for it, but at least think a little differently than they did when they first walked in the room, mm-hmm. because of something that you've shown them, and you can also back it up by giving examples of, in the past, how this worked for another show very similar, mm-hmm. in scenario to what's going on with your show.
And that's a trust issue, yeah? I mean, they're trusting you.
Yeah, and sometimes the client trusts you. Sometimes they're very hesitant. But it seems to me if they've come to you, there should be a little bit of trust there to begin with.
I would think at this point in your career, there would be very few people who would not trust you. Or are there still people that aren't sure?
Well, there are always people that just, I think more today is that they don't trust their instincts.
Right.
And, they're sort of like a little floundering. I don't think anybody questions my ability, because certainly my track record is good, and now
Yes.
of course I always have the book to throw at them if they say anything.
Yeah, the book is awfully good backup. Yes.
Yeah, it is a good backup.
Well, in the very beginning of your career, which is always interesting to me, where people start from. In the beginning of your career, did it take a while for people to, for you to convince people that you were doing things that they were okay for them, or did they immediately get it?
No, when I first started, like I said, when I was first hired at Blaine Thompson, which was the theatrical advertising agency for many, 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 many years.
Mm-hmm.
I first had to convince my boss that he should show my work. They hadn't hired me as a designer. They hired me in the production department. But I was allowed to read scripts and design starting at 6 o'clock when my workday finished. And that's what I would do. We had every script coming to Broadway and off-Broadway going through that office.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just read a bunch of scripts, and the ones that I liked the best, I would design stuff for. But, once again, showing my boss, I designed this last night, what do you think, would you show it at the meeting? It took a while, I think, for him to get used to the idea that somebody in the office actually was even interested to do that. Because no one, he did. That was his job. And there was an assistant art director, and that was his job. But no one in the production department, I don't think, ever really had any designs on doing this.
So there's a powerful lesson in what you just said, which is that you went above and beyond to prove something to someone for something that you hadn't been hired to do. And I think that sets you apart, Frank, to be honest, because I think most people just go in and do their jobs and go home.
Well, I mean, it's a great, and certainly I made sure I knew how to do my job that I was hired for, and was good at it before I started trying to infiltrate the other section, which they weren't really thinking of me for.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, just so people understand, what is the difference between the production? What is production versus the creative end?
Right. Well, we're going back to the 70s, so it's certainly a lot different now in terms of physically what had to be done. But back when I started, the production department was in charge of putting together all the ads for the New York Times and other newspapers. There were quite a few publications in New York that had daily theatrical advertising sections.
Right.
And what that entailed was getting the piece of art for a show. So say, for instance, I was working on for Dracula with Frank Langella. That
Yes.
had this beautiful Edward Gorey art.
Yes.
I would have to design how the art was placed in the ad and where the information would go, and where the theater information went, and take all of those elements and make it work in a 2.5-inch by 3-inch space. So it was good training in terms of how to make your ad pop out of a page of similar ads. But also it gave me a chance to work with other artwork, so that I personally learned if your artwork was too complicated, it was difficult to work with. And if it was too basic, no one looked at it. So I did learn a little bit about how complex or not the concept should be in order for it to work in various mediums that we had to work with it in.
I think that's also quite valuable. What you're talking about is simplicity is a better sell usually, I think.
It definitely is, because when you're dealing with trying to get someone's attention with your piece of art, or even your title treatment on a speeding bus, it's got to make an impression. And the simpler it is, the more you're going to retain. The more complex it is, the less you're going to retain. And you may have to see it, even with the simplest message, have to see it 4 or 5 times in different places for it to finally register.
How frequently in your career have you been completely surprised by the choices people have made, of the choices you've given them, of the selections?
A few times. I really have come to learn that I cannot predict how the clients are going to react to a presentation. I might think I would have like my favorites or my thoughts, but I certainly wouldn't bet on them, that's for sure.
So I want to go in a slightly different direction here. Obviously you start with the script, so you know the story. You know the story ahead of most people. In fact, you know the story probably ahead of pretty much everybody except for the audience. Are there, I know you don't have any ability to predict, but are there stories that when you read them is there something about them that makes your work easier or more difficult, or is there something that that writers could do that would make the job that you have in some way easier?
I don't know. I mean, I think once again it comes down to personal taste. I am a person who loves musicals, and I love murder mysteries. So any script that involved either of those two elements, always really got me all fired up. Like, I was always very excited to be working on them. Sometimes I'd read a script and think, oh my goodness, this show is so depressing. How would I possibly work on this? But you sort of, once you sort of admit to yourself, I find this depressing, I try to actually make the image convey that message, but not in such a heavy way that it's throwing you off in terms of what the actual message of the show is. I don't know if I'm articulating that well.
I think you are.
It's the things that I think I get most fired up about, and the things that I can truly come up with, countless concepts for, are the things that I find the most exciting, which would be a mystery or a musical.
So what do you then find when you receive it? You go, this kind of script or this genre you find more challenging, more difficult. What would that be? Romantic comedy?
Anything? No, actually, I love those too. Those are fun to work on and design for. I have to say something. The only show, and I don't even remember the title of it, the only show I ever turned down working on was about street drug addicts in New York, and I just read it and just thought, I can't even imagine how to sell this. It just did not go through my my process. I couldn't do it, so I finally told them that I just didn't think I was right for it. So something like that, to me, just doesn't work. So
in your whole career, you've only turned down one show?
As a freelancer, yes. I've been on my own since 2010. So before that, I worked at ad agencies, and if I had to work on that show, of course I would. But I would certainly have gone to my boss to say, I don't think I'm right for this.
So, okay, the work that you do has changed, I imagine, because of the computer. It's changed physically for you from what it was in the beginning.
Absolutely.
The way that you sit and actually physically address your work is different now than it was in the past. And what are for someone that does what you do all day long, what are the physical challenges?
Well, physical challenges is just to make sure you get up and move around every once in a while so that you're not paralyzed at the end of the day. If that's what you meant by physical
that is
challenge.
what I mean. Do you have repetitive motion issues or anything like that?
Well, no. I definitely try to. It's very easy to sit there and get it all out in one fell swoop. It's very tempting to do that. But I find that after 4 hours of sitting there and not moving, when you try to stand up, it's not such an easy issue.
It's creaky. You get
So,
creaky. I know.
yeah.
I have the same problem. I understand because my job
Yeah.
is at a desk sitting all day long too. So I get it. And you have to physically get up and stretch your body out.
Yep.
Or you
Just
or
get
you
up
wind
and
up.
move around a little bit. It also clears my head.
Mm-hmm.
So, and at this point in time, I know my work process and thought process well enough to feel secure that, okay, I know what I'm doing with this. I don't have to look at it for about a half hour. I could just go off and, chill and come back to it and be at the same point I was when I got up.
Do you ever get blocked?
Oh, yes. Usually, I'd say if I do, it's at the beginning of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think that something we touched on before about my not giving my opinion about what I thought of the script I've read.
Right.
Is that when I worked in the ad agencies, my office was always open, obviously, and people could come in and see what was on my drawing table or on my screen. And, you're open to criticism. Anybody who walked in the office would look at what I was working on and say, oh, you really think that should be blue? Or you really like that? Or, and, you're at a very sensitive point, as you would know.
Yes.
Very sensitive point in the creative process where you don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that you're questioning this.
Oh,
because I'm questioning it.
It's a
So I have to figure it
sensitive
out.
dance that you do as an artist. Almost any
Yeah.
artist. And you can't the development of an idea is a very fickle thing, so you have to protect it. You've got to nurture it.
Yes. And also, I may not quite, I may have started in on the design process and thought the idea was worth going that far, but I may be at a point where I'm not sure I should go further.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the best time for someone to come in and question what you're doing.
No.
That's the one great advantage of now working on my own is that, I don't have people walking in and out of my office criticizing of what I'm doing.
No, I think that's a lot. Most of my career has been as a freelancer, so I understand being your own boss, so to speak. That's a much different animal than being in an office with people all day long.
Yeah, and once again, there was also an advantage to having, because I certainly worked with other designers, to having other designers who also were very sensitive to that and didn't really offer their opinion unless you asked for it.
Sure.
But at least they were there so that if I did have a question, like, do you think this or this is better, someone that I trusted and I knew had great instincts could answer that question and then give me a little more thought about it.
Do you have people in your life, like as a writer? Writers like to when they get to a stopping point in their work, and a lot of writers, myself included, like to give it to trusted friends, and I say that plural. I like to give it to several different people and just let them beat me up, so to speak, because I trust what they're going to say. Do you have people like that you show your work to before you present it to a client?
Well, at an ad agency, I would say everybody had seen it before I got to the presentation stage, so I knew what was going on there.
Right.
In my studio, the only person who sees everything I've designed is my husband, Joe, who's been looking at my work since the early 70s.
Your best critic or your worst critic?
Oh, he's both, because I absolutely trust. He's definitely the man on the street. He's the person who's going to see it going by on a bus, or he's very, very savvy about it, and tells me his thoughts. Sometimes I'll agree, and sometimes I'll think, ooh, I don't really think that that's the case. But then I follow my instincts. Then I just take it from there, and so he's my person of one focus group.
You have a focus group of one. He's got sort of meat and potatoes view of the stuff that you're doing. He's an average viewer, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, he's not a designer, although he has a great design sense. But he doesn't sit down and design things. He's a great baker and a great cook, so that's his major talent.
No.
And
that's not a bad thing to have sitting around.
No, not at all. It's wonderful, actually. I highly recommend it for everyone.
So I want to go back a half a step. We were talking about that occasionally you get blocked. Are there any tricks that you use to get unblocked?
Yes, actually, the thing I do to get unblocked is, since we touched on the fact that I love manipulating type and playing with type, I will start concentrating on just doing a title treatment with no concept of what the poster ultimately is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Just start designing type with the words of the title of the show, and that generally relaxes me to the point where I start coming up with ideas as I'm doing that.
So your unblocking device is to continue to work, but on a specific thing, and that's type.
Yes, on something that relaxes me and doesn't get me sort of caught up in the oh my God, I'm never going to come up with an idea. Which is always a panic-stricken moment.
I'm trying to think. I'm using my memory here. I'm trying to think of going through the book, which I've looked at numerous times at this point. You don't have too many posters that you've designed that are, or advertising that is just words only. Most of your stuff has some kind of imagery to it.
Some of it. I always, I very much am drawn to a client who asks for a type design that is the art, and sometimes that is the request.
Mm-hmm.
But what I will do, I have my favorite story about that. I'm a big fan of Tennessee Williams, and this is now going back many, many years. There was going to be a star-studded production of The Night of the Iguana, which is one of my favorite plays, and it was going to start out of town. But the directive from the producers was that it had to be a type treatment. They did not want to see any images. They wanted just a type treatment, and that was it. They weren't going to look at anything else. So the entire, agency, that's what we all worked on. Everybody was working on title treatments. But during this process, I thought I had a great graphic idea using an image. Very simple image, but it was an image. And I thought, I'm going to do this anyway, since I had time. So I did this poster. And at the time, my boss, who was the creative director, was presenting. And she said, I don't think I'm going to show this because they specifically asked not to see this stuff. And I said, well, fine, here it is. Do whatever. And we had this whole presentation. Fortunately, I was in the room, so I was actually able to witness it. She made this entire presentation, and they were talking about many of the logos. And ultimately, we're coming to the conclusion that none of it was quite right. And lo and behold, my boss held up this poster I had just given her, which she didn't think she was going to show.
Mm-hmm.
She said, how about this as an option? And everybody loved it, and that was it. That was the one they used. So out of town, the show never got to New York, unfortunately. But
right.
Out of town, this was the poster. And I always thought, okay, that's a valuable lesson for me because I could just as easily not have done that idea.
I think you have already said several things, working early on in the production department and then something like that, that you don't have a problem being a little bit of a maverick, which is, I think, important. That you're doing things that are not necessarily.
I don't feel like you're being a maverick. I just feel like I'm doing something I want to see.
Let me clarify that. I don't mean maverick in the sense that you're like pushing yourself around or being a little bit wild. What I mean is you don't have a problem going off book a little bit.
Right.
So in your production department, you weren't supposed to be doing the other stuff, but you did it anyway. And here somebody said you're not supposed to be doing a design that's typeface only, and you did it anyway. And so that's what I'm saying. To me, that's pushing an envelope in a very good way.
Yeah, I mean, as it turned out, and especially in this instance for that show, it was a very happy conclusion because the other option would have been everybody had to go back and start all over again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
so my boss was quite happy with that.
Sure,
conclusion.
And you had done something, and it made you happy, which is even more important.
Yeah,
I think.
Very much so.
So you have clearly spent a lot of time working with producers, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And a certain number of directors, I've no doubt.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you, when you started out, and you were, even though you were working for someone else, when you were interacting with producers and or directors, was there something that you did back then that you learned early on it was great to keep doing that has helped you along the way? And the opposite of that, was there anything that you now know not to do with producers and directors?
Well, I mean, I do believe a part of my success with this particular form of artwork is that I can be very diplomatic in terms of taking criticism. I've found that as certainly an art director and creative director working with other artists, that 90% of them cannot take any criticism.
Mm-hmm.
Nor be diplomatic about it. So I think that was a big advantage for me, is that I very, because of my early agency exposure and a lot of rejection, certainly, I did a lot of posters that were never used originally, but you just learn from the criticism. And maybe that's part of my school training at Pratt and Art and Design, is that you should listen to criticism, weigh where it's coming from, and sort of move it forward. Then, okay, now let's rethink this, or let's just start over.
That is a perfect description of how all artists should think. I think. When I teach, because I've been teaching for a number of years, and when I teach, that's one of the key lessons that we teach students is, you need to learn to take the criticism. You may not agree with it, but you should take it and not let it throw you off your game.
Right.
And I think that's what you're saying.
The one thing I learned is that there is always another way to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
I may have thought I'd came up with the perfect solution, or the perfect poster, and if it got shot down, certainly it didn't close me down. It wasn't like I would think, well, on to the next one. I would, if I knew everyone was going back to rethink something, I certainly did that. I would find it kind of exhilarating, at the same time annoying, that this piece I thought was so wonderful, was never going to see the light of day.
But I'm guessing that at this point, and probably fairly early on, you learned not to become too attached to anything.
No, well, you really can't. I could become, if I loved it so much, if I thought it was brilliant, I should frame it and put it in my house.
Sure.
But, that would be the extent of it, if I thought it was so fantastic. But, it's commercial art, which I love. And you sort of, if people aren't reacting to it, there's a reason for that. Maybe I was just off kilter for this one.
Sure.
Once again, working at an ad agency, there were many, many instances where my work wasn't used and another artist was. And, that's how you learn also. It's like, okay, now what about this poster drew them to it? What was so, specific about it, or, what were the reasons they used this? And, it's all a learning process. You just have to have a thick enough skin to learn from it.
Absolutely. And that thick skin sometimes takes a little while for some artists to develop. Some people have it naturally. Sure. But I think that's true for actors, it's true for directors, it's certainly true for writers and so on, that you need to have that thick skin, because you're going to get rejection, and your work frequently is not that precious, but some people have to get over that hurdle in their lives.
Right.
Right. So what do you do? Obviously, you are presented with some form of a job, and my guess is that more often than not, you have a deadline of some kind. Do you do anything particular to stay on deadline, or is it just a natural thing for you at this point?
No. At this point in time, I really know how to gauge my time. I'm really great at time management, at least for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I know how long it takes me to do this or that, or I always leave enough time for myself so that if I do have a day or two where I'm vacillating like on the concept, is I'll never come up with an idea. I do need time to work out of that, even if I'm designing the type as the time filler.
Mm-hmm.
No, I always leave enough time, and they're basically, unless I always tell a client after our initial talk while I'm off working that if they have a thought or if something comes to them that they think is important, they should always share that with me, just so I put it in the back of my mind as a reserve. And, if that happens during my design process, I very much consider that an important piece of information, because if they thought about it and thought enough of it to pass on to me, I try to process that into a concept.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes that happens toward the end of my design process.
Okay, so how do you keep the well stocked? How do you refresh the well? What do you do for inspiration?
Well, you look at everything around you, everything, and certainly going back to we talked about Drew Struzan and Richard Ansel
Mm-hmm.
and David Byrd. I go back to my favorite artists to see what their work was and how they treated. What I don't know. I can't even think right now. What hair looks like, or just stuff like that. That sort of revitalizes you, and then you just sort of, in terms of theater, just walking around Times Square can sort of give you a little bit of brain damage, but you also learn what pops out. It's like, okay, I'm looking at this. Why am I looking at this one when there were 47 other billboards around it?
Mm-hmm.
So, I think, that little analytical computer in my head gives me little clues here and there in terms of that. At least when I was first starting out, that was a big influence on me, is what caught my attention on Times Square. And then would look in the newspaper to see how it applied in a small New York Times ad. So how did that translate? And did it translate as well as it did on the billboard?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't.
So in other words, your inspiration is just the world you're in.
At this point, but I mean, it's certainly the design world I'm in. I'm not talking about looking at a lamp in someone's house and being inspired by it or anything like that. But basically, I'd say the graphic nature of what's around us, signage-wise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm very receptive.
So tell us about your workspace. Is there anything special that you have to have around you in order to do your job?
Well, I do have my favorite things around me. I mean, my office, I'm fortunate now to have an entire floor in my brownstone as my office,
Wow.
which is a huge luxury.
Yeah.
And I have a gorgeous view of a wooded area and a rock wall. And, I mean, it's just all very, very zen and fabulous and pleasant, which is something totally different than what I had in New York. But, I'd say my office is filled with movie posters and books. I have books everywhere. I'm a huge reader, and I love reading. So I'd say those are the things that make me feel very comfortable and just sort of cozy while I'm working.
And there's do you go to the books frequently? Are you constantly looking in them?
I have to say, yes, I actually do have Drew Struzan's book, which is quite beautiful. I don't know if you have it or not. It's really great.
I do not.
And yeah, I have many, many, many art books of famous designers and illustrators. And it serves as inspiration. I mean, sometimes I'll leaf through them not to get a concept, but just to look at how beautiful they are and how smart they are, and just sort of revel in. Okay, this is what I want to try to get this poster to look like.
So they're forms of inspiration. Yeah, I think that's.
Oh yeah, absolutely, huge forms of inspiration.
Do you have a particular show that is your favorite that you've done?
Of mine?
Yes, of stuff you've worked on.
Yeah, Sunday in the Park with George is definitely my favorite.
That's maybe the single, I have to tell you, I think it's maybe the single best poster ever.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you very much.
I can't think of too many that do more in such little, I don't know what the right word is. The suggestion is right there in front of you. And yet the poster itself it's full of color and it's got Surratt and all the rest of it, but you're getting the whole message in one fell swoop. And that's a remarkable poster to me, that particular poster.
Oh, thank you.
And of course,
I do love it. It is one of my favorites.
And as I said before, I think my particular favorite is in fact the Sweeney Todd poster. I think that's
that's a close second.
It's pretty doggone good. It's really memorable.
Thank you.
So we're
well, that show, both shows, in both those instances, it's look what you're trying to live up to. Look what you're trying to encapsulate. It was quite challenging and very daunting, but it's at that point it's fun. It's kind of exciting to try to get that.
Well, when you were working on the Sunday in the Park with George poster, I'm guessing it must have been a eureka moment when you realized you could have the two halves.
Well, I don't know if you knew the story, but originally, when I had gotten the script, it was very early on, this Schubert organization, I guess, wanted to do some early exploration on art. So they gave me the script, and there was no second act. I just had the first act.
Is that right?
Yep. So I asked, is this the whole thing? And they said, no, it's just the first act. And I said, well, what happens in the second act? And they said, well, it's not really written yet. It just takes place 100 years later. Now go off and design something.
Wow.
So that's what I did.
Wow. That I did not know that.
And they never, that was and this amazes me more than anything. Of all the shows that I've ever worked on, whether in an ad agency or on my own, I was the only artist asked to work on it. I did 3 pieces. They chose that one, and they never wavered from it. They, stuck with it the whole time, and that is remarkable to me for a huge musical like that.
Does someone like Stephen Sondheim get involved in that process?
Yes, somewhere along the way, yes, he did. He always did. He did with Sweeney Todd and certainly Sunday in the Park, and always. And I worked on his only play, the play he wrote with George Firth called Getting Away with Murder.
Right. Which,
of course, I ate up because it was a murder mystery.
Murder mystery, yeah.
So I was really excited to work on that. He's very, certainly can tell you what he's thinking, but is very clear to explain that he doesn't feel comfortable speaking in the language of graphics, and that, he's not going to tell you how to do something because he doesn't quite know how to express it or articulate what he's trying to say.
But music and lyrics, that he's got.
Yeah, for sure. But always very pleasant and wonderful to work with. I always was very, very excited whenever I was working on one of his projects.
And understandably, because it's some of the greatest work ever.
I know.
All right, so we're sort of coming toward the end of the podcast. We're almost an hour into this. And so what I'm wondering is, do you have, from all your years in the business, do you have one or more even stories that are kind of quirky or weird or oddball or something kind of strange or funny?
Well, I'll tell one because it should be very close to home for you. When I worked on Jekyll and Hyde, when it was at the premiere production at Alley.
Yes, in Houston.
Had gone through the whole art process, and art was chosen. The agency decided to go down to Houston to the premiere, which was wonderful. So we all went. There was a whole group of us. And we sat through the show, which was really exciting. And then we went to the party afterward. And I walked into the party, and people were coming over to me, congratulating me and telling me what a great job I had done. And I thought, wow, how do they know I did this poster? I don't understand it. And then, like, a about 10 minutes later, Chuck Wagner, the star of the show, walked in, and everybody applauded him. And these people turned to me and said, "Oh, we thought you were in the show." And no, not me. So my big moment of fame wasn't because I had designed the poster, but because they were mistaking me for the star of the show, which I thought was quite funny.
That is funny, and I don't know if you know the history of Chuck with Jekyll and Hyde, but Chuck, when Frank Wildhorn and I first started writing that show, which was in 1980, we knew Chuck, who was a fellow student of ours at USC, and Chuck was the original voice on our recordings of Jekyll and Hyde all the way back in 1980.
Wow.
Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that. That's fabulous.
So I've known Chuck a very long time. Chuck's a dear friend. And he's been involved from the very beginning of Jekyll and Hyde. So last question for you today, Frank, is do you have a good piece of advice or a tip that you can lend to those that are trying to get into the business doing what you're doing? Or trying to get better at it?
Yeah, I mean, I really think the most important thing, although, it's always difficult, as an artist, it's difficult to sort of work over to the business end of it, but I think a really, really important thing for people who want to get into theater advertising, or what I do, which is now generated from the agencies, basically, is to get to know what the agencies are in New York. There are 4 major ones. And, today it's very easy, easily accessed on Google. You go to everybody's website. And what you can do is just learn their aesthetic. So each agency definitely has a look that they sort of tend to use. Not that everything looks the same, but there's a sensibility in the work.
Sure.
So that I think is a very important thing, is to just try to get a sense of what these agencies do. And if there's one that speaks to you, that should be the one you attempt to contact first.
That sounds like the simple phrase on there would be get to know your market.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that is excellent advice for anybody, truthfully, in almost any part of the business, but in particular yours, because there is a very narrow range of opportunity there, correct?
Yep, there is.
Well, that is...
But, it's like anything else. When I first started also, and I'm sure you as a writer can say this also, that you hear people say, "Oh, that's way too competitive a business. You really should think of something else to do."
Mm-hmm.
And, yes, it is. It is a tremendously competitive business, but how great is it to be able to do it?
Well,
so I think it's worth the attempt of trying to get as much information on how to do it, because it certainly makes your life a lot more pleasant.
Oh, no question. And certainly if you don't have the heart for it, it's maybe not for you. But if you do have the heart for it, you have to give it a try. And,
absolutely.
And certainly what you're suggesting is, I would think, absolutely fundamental, and that's, what's the point of trying to do it if you don't understand what the buyers are buying? And so I think that's very wise advice. Well, Frank,
the other piece of advice, and I don't know, am I going over?
No, you're good. No, I'm happy to talk.
The other piece of advice is go to as much theater as you can, as it's so costly. Nowadays, it's a very tough thing to tell someone.
Very.
But certainly it would be very helpful in terms of someone who was thinking of doing this, just to see a show and say, now what would I have done for that? Or, looking at the art saying I could have done something better than this. Do it. Do something better. See what it is.
Yeah, that goes back one more time to the notion that you went out of your way to do something that wasn't asked of you, and that stood out. And I think that's a good lesson too, that, doing what you know is right in your heart. Obviously, you don't want to do something that's harmful, but doing something that's right, what's the harm? The worst thing somebody can do is say, "Why did you bother with that? I'm not interested." That's the worst thing that can happen.
Exactly.
Best thing that can
the
happen
only
is
time
they
you
take
wasted
it.
was your own.
That's right. And truthfully, I don't know that when you do that kind of thing, that you're ever wasting your time. You're actually learning from it.
Oh, absolutely. You may not know you're learning from it if it's a frustrating experience, but you definitely do learn from it.
Absolutely. It is every bit of artistry, I think, requires the continued growth of the artist, or otherwise it just stagnates. So the one thing that I will say that's plainly obvious from your work is that you have not stagnated. Your work is continually inspiring.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Dear.
Well, Frank, this has been a real treat for me to talk to you on StoryBeat, and I'm so glad that you were able to spend a little time today.
Thank you. It was an honor to be asked.
Oh, my great pleasure, and I hope everybody enjoys listening to the show.
I hope so, too.
Thank you. And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.